Bam. Hey guys. 1996 Ford Escort 1.9 liter single cam 5-speed manual transmission. We just had a cold stint of negative 20-degree temperatures for about 3 days in northwest Indiana. And during the 3 days, or as soon as it started to get cold, he started to lose his pedal on his clutch. So that leads me to believe that his master had died. There's no fluid coming out of the slave, and the master had no fluid coming out of it, so I think fluid was bypassing the piston inside the slave, and it was pretty much topped up on brake fluid. There's a little bit of seepage on this proportioning valve on this master cylinder, so that may need to get addressed. I'll let him know that when he picks it up. Hopefully changing the master cylinder out, which was like $35 from a local auto parts store in town. I called everybody. Only the one old school auto parts store had it. And that should be that. So I'm going to swap it out, throw on my little vacuum Mighty Vac brake bleeder, crack the slave open, dump some fluid, top this up completely to the lip of the reservoir, and keep that completely topped up while I vacuum it out, and then tighten it up, top it up again, and see if I get a pedal. The Ford. This thing is going ham, man. I got a little trickle of oil in there. Is just going crazy. All right. To remove the battery, it is, if these are factory, 214 millimeters to remove the battery bracket. These terminals have been replaced already with AutoZone Auto Store cheapies. So that was a 13 millimeter or ½ inch. The factory is probably 8 or a 10 millimeter. To remove the battery tray, to have slightly more room to access the master cylinder, I took that out as well. And this one only had 2 bolts out of the 4. The other 2 were broken off into the driver's side frame leg. And those were 10 millimeters. I removed the tray, and that gave me access to the feed pipe to the master cylinder. So this hose, one crimp clamp on either side, removed that. That allowed me to drain the old nasty fluid out of the master cylinder. Then I removed the lower bolt on the master cylinder, and that was a I believe it was a 12 millimeter. And then inside of the car, there is also a stud. And then that one was also a 12 millimeter. And there had a little E-clip on the clutch pedal. There is the master cylinder. There's a little E-clip that's on the pin. There's a little plastic bush inside the clutch pedal assembly arm. Don't lose that. Don't lose the E-clip. And the 12 millimeter socket is on the upper left-hand side of the bracket, and it is almost impossible to see up there, but it's centered in picture. It's just really hard to get up there to get any kind of a view on it. I had to get that one by feel. And a top tip to access bleeding the clutch system on the early 90s Ford Escort was keep the reservoir completely full all the way to the tip top. I took all the lash out of the clutch pedal, so there's 0 lash with the adjustment rod. It was also a 12 millimeter. nut. There's the bleed screw covered in grease. I use grease as a seal for air on all hydraulic fittings. So I removed the bleeder itself, cleaned all the threads, and put grease on the threads. Not inside the cylinder though, just on the screw itself, and not on the tip where it pinches off, just on the threads, and not towards the inside of the cylinder. And that gives it a good seal. And whenever I place my Mighty Vac brake bleeder on something, there it is, I always use grease to seal the tip and its connection, because normally you get a little stream of bubbles in the line, and that reduces any kind of a vacuum leak on the vacuum system itself. So it's a top tip, so you're not chasing leaks when there aren't any. The top tip, I took a impact socket and I jammed it between the clutch fork and the bell housing. It was like a 22 or 24 millimeter, and I just slid it on the fork here, and see if I can get a good shot of it. There. I slid it between the fork and the bell housing here, and that compressed the slave cylinder all the way to get rid of the air pocket that was in the slave cylinder itself. And then that allowed me to get all of the air out of the clutch system. So I'm going to have to do that from now on, is block the slaves and compress the piston in there, and then start bleeding from that. So I bled the system, then I compressed the cylinder, bled the system again, and between each bleeding I would go into the car and kick the clutch pedal about 30 times, and then I would rebleed the system. And then after I finished it, got all the air out, I topped up the reservoir again, and then I bled the system for a 4th time, making sure there was no air in it. And then I covered the bleeder with axle grease to keep it from corroding. And I removed the fan. It sits in there upside down. This is the top, one 10 millimeter here, and two 10 millimeters along the driver's side of the radiator on the end tank. There's our little nutserts here, and then down here and there, and it just sits into that little metal clip right there. So I just did that to give me easier access. Had one little plug, 3 10 millimeters, popped right off. Not too bad of a job. Went fairly straightforward. Had the wrong battery in here. I'm going to have to make some sort of a spacer to get the battery up flush, or modify the battery tray to allow me to tighten down the bracket, because the battery's too short, even sitting on top of the battery tray itself, for me to tighten up the threads all the way. So I'll have to look to that. And then on to getting the license plate mounted and license plate lights working later. Alright guys, this is the master cylinder. It had one flare fitting at the bottom. That's where the rubber master cylinder reservoir to clutch master cylinder soft hose goes at the top. And there is the stud looking at the master cylinder from inside the cabin. So it's in that upper left hand slot. And then on the firewall side, that's the lower stud that it slides onto, and I believe they're both 12 millimeters. So just remove the bracket, remove the battery tray if you want to have just a touch more access, and that's about it. All right. Had a hole in the exhaust. Had a hole in the exhaust. The hanger flexed and broke it. I took the hanger, flipped it around backwards, so now it'll break a new hole over here, but I welded it all up, put a piece of 1/8 inch steel plate on it, cut a V in it, bent it into a V, welded up the V, welded all the way around it, quieted up, deleted a heat shield, deleted some of the fuel tank skid plate. Mostly it just pulled down. New sway bar end links. And I replaced and greased up a soft brake hose. And hopefully that'll keep it from rusting in case I have to get back in there. And I might do the same on the other side. And you're not supposed to use compression fittings on brake lines. They don't hold up to the pressure. All right. The license plate was in the back window. Both these license plate retaining screws were seized. I ended up freeing this one up, but drilling out the threads, drilling this one out, and it didn't have lower ones. So I installed the top two. I welded nuts, 7/16 inch nuts, to both original locations. I scribed the marks on the bottom, drilled both holes out, and then tacked welded the 7/16 inch nuts to the bottom of the plate. And both license plate lights were burnt out, and I ended up drilling out the screws. And cutting one half of the light, one of the ears off. And then I changed the bulbs, hit them with dielectric grease, and siliconed the covers back on. Because that's pretty much what they looked like. They were really rusty. But now I just got to change the third brake light and full send.